Okay, so let's continue on the long run aggregate supply curve model. So again, we're back to our graph, and I'm going to go through an example of how this would work. And this is not something that you are ever going to be expected to do, but it will show you what we mean when we say that in the long run, the economy gravitates toward equilibrium. So let's pretend that we are right here, okay? So we are at aggregate demand 1 and long run aggregate supply here, okay? So we are at equilibrium, price, and quantity. But now the aggregate demand curve moves to the right. So aggregate demand is increasing. It's moving from here, aggregate demand 1, to here, aggregate demand 2. So the initial thing that happens is we move up the long run aggregate supply curve, and in the short run, we're going to have the prices and the quantity go up. All right, so we're moving from here, and we're moving, for example, to right about here. So inflation happens, and inflation happens because we've moved from price 1 to price 2. So remember, the x-axis represents the quantity of real GDP. The y-axis represents the inflation rate or the price level. So it's the price level of all things, which is the inflation rate. So in the short run, inflation happens, but we're moving from here to here on real GDP. So that's a good thing, right? So the equilibrium quantity goes up. So what happens then is that creates more jobs. So we're producing more. So this is our potential, but we're now producing more. So that means we need to use more resources. And one of the resources that we're going to use is going to be labor. So that means that unemployment will go down and the short run aggregate supply will go up. Then the long run aggregate supply will be pulled over to a new equilibrium where prices go back to where they were, but we are at a higher output. All right, so new equilibrium, we return to price 1 with a higher real GDP. So this tendency to move towards full employment in the long run, and remember, when we say full employment, it is not only full employment of labor, we're talking about full employment of all of our resources. So that's land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial skills. So full employment in the long run, it's called self-regulating. It is the basic belief of classical economics, and it is considered the laissez-faire approach. And laissez-faire just means leave it alone. So the basic premise here is if you leave the economy alone, if there is not a lot of outside influence in the form of government, then the economy will self-regulate. So that's the difference between Keynesian economics and classical or neoclassical. Keynesian economics focuses more on the short run and more government involvement. So what happens when the short run equilibrium is greater or less than the potential? Well, that's when we have a gap. So we can either have a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap. So let's go with the recessionary gap first. So in a recessionary gap, this is our potential, the long run aggregate supply, and here we have Q sub N, the natural or potential rate of real GDP. But here is where we really are, all right? So this is where we potentially could be, but this is where we are. So here we're producing less output than potentially we could, all right? So if we're not using all of our resources well and wisely, one of the main resources that we're not using is labor. So here, if our equilibrium rate in actuality is less than our potential, then that means the unemployment rate is greater than the natural rate of unemployment. So we are below full employment. So that means we have high unemployment and we have low production levels. And this graph shows this little triangle right here. That's the recessionary gap. And if we had numbers here and here and here and here, we could actually come up with a dollar figure for the recessionary gap. And why would we want to do that? Well, when we get into monetary and fiscal policy, a lot of those policies are designed to close this gap. So in order to close it, you need to know how much it needs to be closed. You need to know by how much real GDP needs to be increased in order to reach our potential. So that is the recessionary gap. Okay, so recessionary gap is always when we're producing under our potential. So an inflationary gap is the opposite. In an inflationary gap, here we have our potential. We're actually doing better than expected. So what could be bad about that? We're actually producing a greater amount of real GDP than predicted. Well, the bad thing about that is we're going to have a higher level of inflation, because if we're using more resources, then that means that resources will be more scarce, which means that the price will be driven up. So if the real quantity produced is greater than our potential, that means the unemployment level is less than the natural rate of unemployment. Unemployment that is really low means that output is high, but so are prices. And this amount right here is the inflationary gap. All right, so I'm going to stop there, and the next segment will be on the consumption function.